The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
All right. Good evening, everyone. This is Jim Ostrowski with Michigan Department of Environment, Great Lakes, and Energy, and I welcome you to our evening webinar, public information webinar on Michigan's Adaptive Management Plan. Got a kind of a smaller group today, which is fine. We did the same webinar last week. We're doing it again tonight. Just a couple housekeeping guidelines before I turn it over to our presenters. First of all lines are muted, which means that you can hear us, but we can't hear you. If you do have a question, go ahead and type it into the question box on your GoToWebinar question bar, and we'll be getting to those after the presentations. We are recording the webinar for those that have to leave early, or maybe you want to watch it again or pass it on to somebody. So we'll send that recording out to all of you in the next few days by email. And also, if you look in the handouts tab, there is a copy of today's slide presentation. So that's under the handouts tab in your GoToWebinar toolbar. You'll find a PDF document right there. Today we got three presenters. First presenter is going to be Mike Alexander from Michigan Department of Environment, Great Lakes and Energy. Phil Argeroff, also from Michigan Department of Environment, Great Lakes and Energy. And Joel Kelpinski from the Michigan Department of Agriculture and Rural Development. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Mike. So Mike, I'm changing it over to you. Go ahead.
Great.
And before, as Mike's getting set up, just want to remind everybody that we are all broadcasting remotely, so we are all in different locations. So bear with us as we, if we do have to deal with any situation. So go ahead, Mike.
Great, Jim. Can you see my screen okay?
Yeah, well, I got it.
Great. So thanks everybody for joining us. I really appreciate you being here. We're going to talk about our draft adaptive management plan that's currently out for public comment. Here's our presentation overview. Not only are we going to talk about the plan, we're going to talk about why Michigan is using it, our progress that we've made in certain areas, examples of how we hope to use the adaptive management plan, our time frame for rolling it out, how we hope to report on it once it's out. And we also want to discuss a little bit about some of our focus areas, such as wetland restoration, our NPDES program, and our agricultural programs. So let's get started. What is adaptive management? Well, it's basically a learning-based management system. We can use this to systematically determine if we are meeting our goals and objectives, and it's basically set up in two phases. The setup phase, which is where we gather our stakeholders together, we define our objectives and alternatives, we look at what monitoring data is available, what monitoring or models are available to help us solve the problem of phosphorus in Western Lake Erie. And I kind of equate this to the Annex 4 process that US EPA and Environment Canada led the way for, that we and the various states such as Michigan participated in. The second phase is an iterative phase. It's the phase where we make the decisions to meet the objectives that were set up in this, that we established in the setup phase. We make these decisions, how we want to implement goals, and we monitor those implementation phases, and then we assess how well we did. If we did a good job, do we stay on target, on track with that same approach, or do we modify and try to do something different to try and better reach our objectives? And not only do we kind of adjust in the iterative phase, we use information from that to go back to our setup phase and look at our objectives and see if they're reasonable, look at our alternatives and see if those are working. So it's kind of a feedback process. Why is Michigan using the adaptive management process? Well, for one thing, US EPA requested all the states to incorporate adaptive management into their domestic action plans. With Governor Whitmer's executive order renewing our commitment to the 40% phosphorus reduction by 2025, our quality of life agencies, the Department of Agriculture, Rural Development, Environment, Great Lakes and Energy, and Natural Resources, felt like with the tools that we currently have available, this is the best process that we can use to reach that 40% goal. So this is really a complex problem here. This is the tool that we hope that we can use to be able to show a better picture of Western Lake Erie than what I'm showing right now. So before we get too deep into the adaptive management process, I want to talk about some of the targets that were established as part of the development of our domestic action plan and part of Annex 4. Here's some big targets that are addressed and identified from the domestic action plan, from the Detroit River loading reductions, River Raisin loading reductions, and Maumee Trib loading reductions. You can see our goal for that 40% reduction by 2025 for the Detroit River is over 500 metric tons. We want to reduce approximately 70 metric tons just from the River Raisin alone, 33 of which will come from its springtime loading. And for our Maumee Tribs, we're looking to reduce another 100 metric tons. I do want to point out that the Annex 4 described and recommended a reduction of 40% of soluble reactive phosphorus as well, but unfortunately they didn't establish the loads. Now, not only are we working through the adaptive management process, but our federal partners are as well, and we're working with them in this as they're working with us in our adaptive management, and hopefully they will help us establish these spring phosphorus loads. But in the meantime, we're going to try to continue to look for opportunities to reduce that soluble reactive phosphorus as well. So how are we doing? The good news is we've met our 2020 goal of approximately 20% reduction, and mostly through the point source reductions. And I'm going to let Phil talk about that more in a little bit. When we first started down this reduction road, we originally thought we were doing pretty well by looking at some River Raisin data. And I'm going to talk about that right now. Here's a map of the River Raisin. The red dot shows the location of a U.S. Geological Survey gauging station. This is a location where we've been collecting data for a lot of years and having that analyzed. It's data collected almost on a daily basis, so it's a very robust data set. When we looked at the baseline year of 2008 through 2016, as this figure shows, we thought we were on target. We really thought we were making progress, that we were getting some nutrient reductions, and we wanted to stay that course. But when we looked at 17, 18, and 19 data, we realized that we have some work to do. And we have some ideas about why those nutrients went up. And Joe's going to talk about that a little bit more. But our goal is to try and use this adaptive management process to get those numbers heading back in the right direction again. So, how are we going to use the adaptive management process? Well, it's a six-step process. They're iterative steps. We established our goals as part of the domestic action plan development. We're going to use adaptive management to plan these goals. We're going to come out with a plan every 2 years that we can implement. We can monitor the effectiveness of those implementations. We can evaluate and adjust. And so let's talk about some of the plans that we could implement. We want to not only implement a certain percentage of BMP implementation, where we're actually reducing nutrients, we hope, but we want to implement a plan to monitor that as well. And by monitoring, we're going to monitor not only our water quality, but we want to monitor how many of the BMPs did we actually get implemented over that 2-year process. Try to figure out why we were successful in getting those in and stay that course, or why we were unsuccessful in getting those BMPs in, and evaluate and adjust and try to figure out how to get more BMPs in the right places to be effective. And we can use this also as we go through and reevaluate the goals established in our domestic action plan. We'll talk about that schedule in just a little bit. So again, why adaptive management? Well, it's a learn by doing process. We use it to develop our outcome-based performance measures that are described in our Appendix A of the Domestic Action Plan. And if you haven't been there and you haven't looked at it, you really need to. It's going to identify the things that we will spell out in each 2-year plan of how many we hope to implement for, how many BMPs we want to implement within various watersheds, how many CREP practices we want to implement within various watersheds, and then we can track how we're doing. So this is the process that we'll use that. Not only will we be able to use the adaptive management plan to track our implementation and monitoring of BMPs. It'll help us identify and fix our gaps, our data gaps, like monitoring. And I'll talk a little bit more about that in a little bit. Watershed management planning. How many do we have? How many do we really need to be effective out here? And this is the plan that we'll use to help us get there. Most importantly, I think this is a collaborative process. We are hopeful that we can engage not only our internal and external stakeholders, we can get our state, all of our state stakeholders, all of our federal stakeholders involved in working together to find the best path forward to solving this problem. Without engagement, this is definitely going to be a difficult process. So now I want to talk a little bit about some of our initial considerations. This is referred to as an influence diagram. It's very detailed. You know, if you look at the very top of the diagram, our goal is to understand phosphorus loading to Western Lake Erie and how we can affect that loading. Down the middle are all the basic things from transport to the lake from rivers and drains and ditches. How does the phosphorus transport from fields? Is it runoff? Is it tile drains? What are the field activities that we can implement that affect that runoff and ultimately the loading to Western Lake Erie? Things like the BMPs, crop uptake, our legacy phosphorus in soils, application of fertilizers and manure as well. On each side of that center part, there are our management activities that can influence all of those things in the middle. Our NPDES program affects how much nutrients are coming from our point source facilities in Western Lake Erie. Watershed management plan. Do we have the detailed watershed management plans we need to get the right BMPs in the right place? And where are we lacking? We hope to identify that as part of our adaptive management process. And all the other things on the right side of that list, such as our MEEAP program, our CREP program. Research and development. We need a lot of research and development to understand how nutrients are cycled even within the river, so that if we actually can reduce a pound of phosphorus from coming off a field, when do we actually see that reduction at the mouth of the River Raisin? There's market drivers and natural drivers that affect nutrient loading and all these field activities as well, such as commodity prices, conservation incentives, and precipitation. That's a big one that we really are struggling to understand how much precipitation really influences loading to Western Lake Erie, or how we can get reduced loadings when precipitation may continue to rise. A different way to look at that same influence diagram is in this River Raisin conceptual model. It identifies all the key processes that go into nutrient on fields winding up in Western Lake Erie and causing algal blooms, such as atmospheric deposition, hydrological processes, biological processes, geological processes. This is a very intricate, very difficult thing to completely understand, and it's going to take a group effort to get this figured out. So we talked a little bit about monitoring. That's a data gap. This is an example of how we hope to continue to use adaptive management to understand, do we have enough data to show progress? Originally, if you look on the right side of this figure here, you see the River Raisin watershed again, and our USGS station that shows where we have that monitoring. We were lacking monitoring for St. Joe River and Bean Creek. We did some monitoring up in the watershed, not loading analysis, but we did some grad sampling during events and other monitoring over the course of a year. And we've used that data to kind of help identify some of the larger Huck 12 watersheds that are creating, or the smaller, I should say, some of the smaller watersheds within the St. Joe and the Bean Creek, where we could maybe be successful at implementing BMPs to reduce nutrients. USGS got some funding from EPA after we did that monitoring, and they implemented some gauging stations. You'll see those red dots. There's two in the St. Joe watershed there, and then one on the bottom left figure for the Bean Creek watershed as well. They've been there in a little over a year and a half. We've gotten some loading data out of there. They haven't calculated our loads for us yet, but they're working on them. But we're hopeful those stations will be there long enough that we can establish some baseline condition and actually show progress when we get some reductions. In addition to this monitoring data, we're also working towards trying to identify even smaller subwatersheds, some top 12 watersheds, where we can put in more gauging stations in locations where we hope to have a very concerted effort of BMP implementation and show effectiveness. That's something that's going to take a little time yet. Hopefully, we'll be able to identify specifically where those are going to go within our 2-year plan that we're going to talk about here in a little bit. So this is some examples from Appendix A. And again, I really encourage everyone to go back and take a deep dive into Appendix A of the Adaptive Management Plan. It's where we're going to talk about our Adaptive Management Plan to actions. Here's 3 examples, 3 that I think are big ones. We want to identify and track the percentage of deep verified acres, and not only this one says St. Joe and Bean Creek, we're also going to do that in the River Raisin watershed as well. We want to increase our number of agricultural inventories that we do in subwatersheds so we can track better where individual BMPs are implemented around the in smaller watersheds. So we can track progress. Our goal is to get more and more of those every year so we can see progress. And a big one for Department of Ag, and Joe's going to talk about this in a little bit, is our reintroduction of CREP practices and get those back in there. And again, increasing every year. So that's how we're going to track progress. We're going to start at initial base for all of these things like that and see if we can increase the percentages of all these various types of activities. So here's our time frame. We had originally planned to have this plan completed in the end of March. Due to circumstances beyond our control, we've extended that right now till the end of April. We had a public comment that was supposed to end yesterday. We've extended that through early April. We had to cancel due to COVID-19 a March 16th public meeting. And tonight we're having our second webinar to discuss our domestic action, or our adaptive management plan. Now, I will say that we got some questions in our last webinar about could we extend the comment period, and we're evaluating that, and we hope to have some information now. But we have all your email addresses, and when we make a decision on if we're going to extend the comment period, I'll be sure to send you all an email to give you an update as to what time period we're looking at. Ideally, we'd like to have a public meeting so that folks that don't have access to the internet can get their voices heard and be part of the process. How are we going to report out? Here's the time frame. So if you look at just our adaptive management process, we're going to give progress updates on an annual basis in 21 and 22, 24 and 25. In 23, we're actually going to update the DAP. We're going to use the information that we've learned since the DAP was originally completed in 2018 and update it as appropriate. We're also going to develop 2-year work plans for our adaptive management plan. Now, this is a little bit of a confusing diagram, so I'll do my best to explain it. But then once we get our adaptive management plan finalized, we're going to develop a 2-year work plan that's going to set targets for implementations of those various activities described in Appendix A. And then we're going to start that implementation process. And as we get into 21, we're going to start planning our next 2-year process and try to learn from what we have done the previous 2 years to establish better targets and better goals and better implementation plans. And it's going to be an iterative process, again, every 2 years. What we learn in those first 2 to 3 work plans, we're also going to implement and try to incorporate that into the update of our domestic action plan in 2023. So you can see we're going to be thinking about our progress as it's going to be a big part of what we do going forward, and trying to figure out how we can implement our practices and be most effective. So where can you find the adaptive management plan? Well, the easiest place is michigan.gov/Lake Erie DAP. So, and we have heard from others in the previous webinar that there are some people out there that don't have access. I can understand that. So I'm going to ask everyone on the call today, if you could please write this number down, take down Kimberly Passick's name and her phone number. And if you know of someone who would like to comment on this and can't access the internet to get to this domestic action plan, please have them call Kimberly. She'll print out a hard copy and she'll get it in the mail form. And hopefully we'll be able to give them an opportunity to participate in the comment process and be a part of this. Now, in just a minute, I'm going to turn it over to Phil Ergeroff to talk about the NPDES program, but I want to take a minute and talk to you about what our Department of Natural Resources is doing in the creation of wetlands. And what we're doing right now, we want to create some wetlands that are going to be a demonstration project. So we are seeking some willing partners to create this demonstration project to either restore historical wetlands or create new wetland habitats to achieve nutrient reduction, as well as provided some needed wildlife habitat in western Lake Erie. Ideally, it would be at a confluence point of a couple of small watersheds coming together. But at this point, we'll look at all wetland habitat restoration and or creation opportunities and see what we can come up with. If we can come up with a successful demonstration project, what we want to do is take what we've learned from that and implement it throughout western Lake Erie to get as many of these habitat, this wetland creation restoration that we can, and incorporate nutrient reduction, as well as continuing to provide some meaningful wildlife habitat as well. So at this point, I'm going to turn it over to Phil, and Phil's going to talk to you about the NPDES program.
Hey, Mike, this is Jim. Really quick, before we turn over to Phil, we had several people that have jumped on the webinar since we started, and I just want to let everybody know that all the lines are muted. If anybody has a question, we'll take questions at the end, and you can just type that into the GoToWebinar question box that you see on your toolbar there, and we'll get those at the end. So thanks. Go ahead, Phil.
Thanks a lot, Jim, and thanks a lot, Mike, too, for the first part of the presentation. As you can see, adaptive management also focuses on the NPDES program. And when we implemented the original domestic action plan, we looked at 3 key watersheds, as Mike showed you with the targets that he presented on one of his slides. One was the mouth of the Detroit River. One was the downstream location of the Raisin River. And the last was Michigan's portion of the Maumee River. And there's 2 smaller watersheds that are part of that, the Bean Creek and St. Joseph River. When we looked at the Detroit River, as you saw in the targets, we had about 500 metric ton reduction that was necessary at the mouth of the Detroit River, out of the 750 metric tons that we have to remove from Michigan to meet the 40% goal. Now, the 40% goal was targets that were developed based on the 2008 year, and they were established in order to reduce the HAB issue in the Western Basin and the low dissolved oxygen we see in the Central Basin. So we focused on point source reductions at the mouth of the Detroit River. We had a few key wastewater treatment plants to look at. We analyzed all our wastewater treatment plants and determined that these were the most important ones. One is the Great Lakes Water Authority, WRRF. That's the old Detroit wastewater treatment plant. The second is the Downriver Wastewater Treatment Facility, just downstream in Wyandotte. And the third is the Ypsilanti Community Utility Authority wastewater treatment plant. There's one other that's a larger facility that also impacts the Western Basin, and that's the Monroe Metro Wastewater Treatment Facility. Next slide, Mike. So this is an analysis of the loads that we saw since 2008 to 2013, and I'll describe what happened after that as well. For the Great Lakes Water Authority, WRRF. So if you see, it's a significant source of loading to the Western Basin and to the Central Basin, actually, too. You see in 2018 about 760 metric tons of discharge of phosphorus. And that's when they did the original target modeling. That's when EPA and Environment Canada and the targets group in the Domestic Action Plan in Annex 4 established the requirements that were necessary for us to achieve to make the reductions necessary to eliminate the issues we see in the Western Basin and also in the Central Basin. If you look at the loading, it's 760 in 2008, and based on efforts by then the Detroit Wastewater Treatment Plant and now the Great Lakes Water Authority Wastewater Treatment Facility, you see to 2013 a reduction of about 400 metric tons alone from this one key facility. In 2014, 15, 16, and 17, we also saw about loads in the 350 range from this facility as well. So it's maintained that load reduction throughout. We're currently calculating the 2018-2019 loads to make sure that reductions are there, and we're monitoring their compliance, which I'll talk about later. So a significant source is this facility that discharges to the Detroit River. Next slide, please, Mike. If you look through all the facilities that you see that discharge to the Western Basin from Michigan, these are our key facilities. And you can see Detroit on the left side, or the Great Lakes Water Authority facility, and what was a wet weather load in 2011 and a dry weather load in 2012. You can see how this is an order of magnitude higher than the downriver load, which is next to the right of the Great Lakes Water Authority. And then if you look further, you can see the other facilities that we're also regulating, the Monroe plant and the Ypsilanti plant as well. The third bar there you see are other wastewater treatment plants. So if you add up the phosphorus load from all the other point source wastewater treatment plants, you see it's a relatively insignificant load when you're looking at all of them together. So what we did for compliance purposes and engineering purposes and regulatory purposes is we focused on the key facilities that would get us the reduction that we need to see in the Detroit River, and also in that's necessary to achieve from Michigan as a whole. Next slide, Mike. One of the things that we were talking about was what we were going to focus on for the Detroit River, and what we were going to focus on for the Raisin River, and what we were going to focus on as well for the Maumee River. As you can see, the Maumee River completely dwarfs the load that we see from the River Raisin and also from the Maumee River. So it's an issue that we have to really work with Ohio on to make sure that we get the reductions that we need in order to achieve the goals in the Western Basin of Lake Erie. And we're working as good partners with Ohio and the other partners in the Annex 4 process. I think this is critical because we have about a 750 metric ton load that we have to reduce. 500 of that 750, or 2/3 of the load reduction that we have to achieve to meet our 40% goal, is at the mouth of the Detroit River. And we're at about 450 metric tons of that when you consider the other facilities that we also have to get reductions for, the downriver facility included. So Detroit itself, or Great Lakes Water Authority, has reduced the load by about 400. All the point source loads will get us to about 450. And we're going to use the adaptive management process to achieve the rest of that, to achieve 500 at the mouth of the Detroit River. What you can see here is that dominates the load that Michigan has to reduce. The Raisin River is also really important, and also Michigan's contributions to the Maumee River. Next slide, please. So moving forward in the adaptive management process, we have to make sure that we maintain compliance at our key wastewater treatment plants. Detroit's already, or Great Lakes Water Authority's already achieved the load reduction that they need to achieve, the 400 metric ton reduction. The other 40 metric tons is going to come when downriver this year achieves their reductions that are already specified in their NPDES permit. We're just now working on implementing all the post-construction requirements in our stormwater permits in Southeast Michigan. So this post-construction requirement will regulate new development as well as redevelopment in those areas. And this post-construction requirement should also help us reduce loads at the mouth of the Detroit River. There's still some CSOs that remain, although Detroit's achieved about 95% of their volume of CSO reduction in the last 25 years. They still have work to do. And we have to make sure that they achieve the rest of their CSO control at that location. And we also have a number of SSO orders, sanitary sewer overflow orders, with another bunch of facilities that have to make sure that they comply with those orders to also reduce that load. One of the last things that we have to do as adaptive management is we have to really understand dissolved reactive phosphorus. And Mike talked a lot about this. If you look at the treatment plants, we think there's going to be a ratio of how dissolved reactive phosphorus relates to total phosphorus based on treatment level. So another thing we're going to look at is the wastewater treatment process from secondary treatment to primary level treatment to treatment at CSO basins and to untreated discharges, and see how that DRP to total phosphorus ratio varies with those discharges. So we still have work to do. We still have a lot of work to do as well in other parts of the basin for non-point source control and ag control. We've made significant progress based on point source control, and we're going to continue to move on with the adaptive management process. I think that's it for me. Thanks, Mike.
Okay, Joe, you there?
So Joe, I think you're up next.
I am here. Good evening, everyone. Here to talk a little bit tonight about the actions we're working on the agricultural side and the kind of the non-point source side of getting Lake Erie cleaned up. Pop to the next slide, Mike. One of the biggest things we've done from Department of Ag side is we already have a program in place, the Michigan Agriculture Environmental Assurance Program, that has actually been in place since about 2001 when the program went live. This program was designed by industry, by the commodity groups, by the governmental agencies. Both EGLE and MDARD have been actively involved in this program from the beginning, as well as some of the federal agencies like the Natural Resources Conservation Service. The program's unique in that it works directly one-on-one with farmers to implement best management practices on their farms to be protective of water quality. Next slide, Mike. The mission is to develop and implement a proactive environmental assurance program, targets all farms of all sizes, all commodity types in the state of Michigan, and ensures that they're engaging in effective practices to comply with state and federal laws, to reduce nutrient loading, as well as allow them to do it in a manner that allows them to continue to operate and be viable businesses, not basically put themselves out of business trying to fix an issue. Next slide. The uniqueness of the program is really the way that it works. Farmers that are participating in the program first have to go through what we call an education phase. We have multiple educational opportunities around the state in any given year, as well as down in the Western Lake Erie Basin. We have the educational seminars that range from a whole variety of topics, including nutrient management, manure management, proper storage of chemicals, fuels, fertilizers, proper applications of those particular items on fields, best management practices to limit off-site movement of those nutrients into waterways, any number of topics. And so the farmer, there's never, we had about 140 of these around the state last year, so there's always an opportunity for farmers and farm operators to find an educational program that suits their particular interests and what they're interested in finding out more about to better manage their operations. Once they complete that phase, they work one-on-one with technicians that are housed in conservation districts around the state. They are conservation district employees. They are the local kind of touch point for the program. There's someone that's based in the community that knows the farmers, that can work one-on-one with the farmers, develop relationships, develop that trust level to work with them to implement change on the farm. They have risk tools that they utilize. They're basically assessment booklets that they walk through with the farmer. They do basically a kind of an informal audit of the farm. They look at all the practices the farmer is using and assign risks based on whether the particular practice in use is good, it's doing a great job keeping nutrients in place, or whether there's other practices that the farmer could implement to do a better job on the farm to limit off-site movement of nutrients. As they work through this process with the farmer, they actually create kind of an action plan for the farmer. Here's the things you're doing great. here's the things that you need to work on. These are particular things that you could do to address those things that need to be worked on. If there's things that need to be fixed on the farm that are going to require, assistance, federal assistance, cost share assistance, they'll work with the farmer to get them through that process with the Natural Resources Conservation Service to implement those practices, those items on the farm, which are going to help reduce erosion, reduce nutrient movement off-site. Once the farmer works their way through that action plan and addresses those risks that need to be fixed or need to be worked on, they actually can request verification in the program. At that point in time, MDARD staff, my field staff, go on the farm, work one-on-one with the farmer. They basically do an audit of the farm. They look back through those assist documents, those risk documents that the technicians use. They make sure that the I's are dotted and the T's are crossed, that all of those pertinent risks have been addressed and mitigated on the farm. And then at that point in time, if they have done that, then they can become verified in the program. The verification lasts for 5 years. There is a re-verification component. It's not a one and done. They will continue working with us to stay involved in the program. And in doing that, we kind of change the mindset of the farms. We keep them actively involved in the program. They have a better understanding of risk mitigation and why it's important and what the end results are if these risks are not mitigated. And so as a result, we have a little better than an 85% retention rate in the program. So farmers that get in this program generally tend to stay in the program. Next slide, please, Mike. The MAEAP program is unique as well in the fact that it assesses all aspects of the farm. It looks at things that are happening on the farmstead itself. That's, kind of what I would consider the physical plant of the farm. That's where your chemicals are stored, your fuel is stored, fertilizer. We'll look at wells. We'll look at livestock lots, livestock manure storages, things like that if they happen to have livestock. The cropping system looks at what's happening in the field, and this is really an important one because this is where nutrients are being applied, manure is being applied, chemicals are being sprayed, for weed control, herbicides, for insect control in the case of pest management on the farm, as well as looking at practices that could cause erosion and result in off-site movement of nutrients. Livestock system is kind of a combination of both farmstead and cropping, because it looks at all aspects of both things that are happening on the farmstead as it pertains to the farm itself, as well as with livestock, you're going to be spreading manure. So it looks at the practices that are being done for manure application on the fields. And finally, our last system, the forest, wetland, and habitat. There are over 10 million acres of privately owned forest lands, wetlands, native areas in the state of Michigan that are under private ownership and managed or in a lot of cases unmanaged by the owners. This system looks at those properties on farms. It allows farmers to go through this, make sure they're managing those particular areas of their farm, because most farms are going to have some wood lots, maybe some wetland areas that aren't farmed, to make sure that they're doing things that are protective of those as well. If you want to see all the risk management tools that I spoke of earlier, you can see right down here there's a URL that you can go take a look at and actually see those documents. You can find them all at that location, and since you all have the download of this presentation, you can go look at your leisure. Next slide, please, Mike. Here's just kind of a heat map of where we have verified, MAEAP verifications around the state of Michigan. As you can see, we do have a very active participation in the Western Lake Erie Basin, as well as up in the Saginaw Bay area, and then the southwest area of the state are our most densely verified areas. So obviously these are big areas for water quality, a lot of water quality concerns, a lot of farmers actively involved in this program. Down in the Western Lake Erie Basin, when I mentioned those conservation technicians, we saw the need to increase our basically our boots on the ground, the people that are critical for making the program go. And so the Western Lake Erie Basin, the 5 counties of Wayne, Monroe, Lenawee, Hillsdale, and Washtenaw, those 5 counties actually have 7 MAEAP technicians housed in the conservation districts there. So they have the highest densities of technicians in the state. Next slide, please, Mike. Here's just some efforts that we've done, the practices that we track, conservation implementation that we track in the Western Lake Erie Basin. I'm not going to go through all these numbers again. You can take a look at those when you look at the presentation itself. These are annually on farms that were, received verifications down in the Western Lake Erie Basin. But these like 7 items are things we consider important. These are the things that both practices and actual reductions resulting from those verifications and the practices those farms have implemented. That was a goal in the original DAP. I believe it was 35,000 new meat verified acres per year. We've stayed mostly on track with that. There have been a couple years, I think we'll see this shortly, where it dipped a little when we've had hard financial years in the farm community in 17 and 18. Those were tough years. Commodity prices are poor, weather's been terrible, so it dipped a little bit, but we came back strong in 19. These are the things that we're trying to do, so you're welcome to take a look at that. These are things that the program does track on an annual basis. Next slide. Other things that the program's been able to do because we have those conservation district technicians in place is it's allowed us to use their time to leverage other opportunities for agricultural producers in the WLEB. We've gotten grants from USDA NRCS. It was a Resource Conservation Partnership Program grant that we leveraged along with Michigan with Ohio and Indiana as partners to get $16 million in cost share to producers in the Western Lake Erie Basin in those 3 states. We've worked closely with the Herb Foundation to get some funding to help create, foster, nurture what we call farmer-to-farmer groups. In the ag community, farmers look to other farmers as first sources of information. And we found several conservation leaders down in the Western Lake Erie Basin that kind of took the reins and said, yeah, we'd like to have some meetings with our fellow farmers. We want to get this thing going. We want to show them not just what it takes to implement conservation, but because of our conservation efforts, these are the things that we've seen that have improved on our farm. And those programs have been very successful. The first one is actually going to be wrapping up later this year, but we're on to the second one. We're going to expand the focus of that into some groups, some young farmers, some women farmers, female farmers, as well as certified crop advisors to help them understand more about the program and the needs, why and how and need to get involved in the program. We also obtained a Great Lakes Restoration Initiative, what we call a STRAND grant, which is basically soil testing and nutrient reduction grant for $765,000. That was direct cost share to farmers to actually do soil testing, to pay for precision application, not just broadcasting of nutrients, but putting them precisely in place at the amounts that were required with a developed and sound nutrient management plan, and then taking a look at the economic analysis, showing farmers through yield data by placing the nutrients more precisely, even at reduced rates, we were still economically at least equal, if not ahead of where we were with other methods of application. And I'd mentioned those, what we call the phase 1 trainings, the educational opportunities for farmers. In the last year, we had 28 of those 140-ish meetings that I mentioned earlier were down in the Western Lake Erie Basin alone. Next slide, please, Mike. The original DAP also called for research. And between EGLE and MDARD and some partners at MSU, we understood the need to do particular research down in the Western Lake Erie Basin. There's no question that we don't have a grasp on everything that's going on. We have many practices in place that we've had for years, filter strips, buffer strips that are protective of water quality. But Mike and Phil both mentioned this dissolved reactive phosphorus component. And we've seen that climbing, and we're trying to figure out how that's happening, why it's happening. what practices we can put in place to reduce that. We certainly know that some of that comes from drainage tiles from fields. The whole basin, not just Michigan's portion of it, but Ohio and Indiana as well, is heavily drained with field tiles. As most people know, this was once the Great Black Swamp back in the 1800s before it was drained, interestingly enough, for mosquito control, but it ultimately became prime farmland. But to be farmable, it's wet, heavy soils, it needs to be drained, and so we have subsoil drainage systems. We know nutrients are moving through there, so we're working with Dr. Hassan Ghani at MSU to take a look at these, some practices on fields that have this drainage. We're monitoring it and trying to figure out what combination of practices, whether it's no-till, whether it's cover crops, changes in systems, precision application of nutrients, grid sampling of soils, that will do the best combination of reducing nutrient movement through the tile lines. The projects that we funded, $1 million investment by MAEAP, MDARD, and EGLE as well as a contribution from MSU, resulted in an overall budget of about $1.5 million to begin with. It's a 5-year project with plans to make sure we find the funding to continue that. And again, we're just going to evaluate BMP efficacy on fields. Next slide, Mike. We also have another project. This one's not actually in the Western Lake Erie Basin. It's in Lake Makatawa, but we have similar systems through other partners that have been installed down in the Western Lake Erie Basin. And this is kind of an inline filtration system. It uses basically iron slag from the foundries. It has an affinity for phosphorus, so we're running tile lines basically through it, and it acts as a filter to remove phosphorus. It will take DRP out of the water. We're trying to find ways to do this in a cost-effective manner. Right now, the systems are relatively expensive to install, and they have a limited shelf life. It's about 10 years before they have to be pulled out and the slag replaced. And also they have what I call diminishing returns. The amount they remove each year declines, and so we're trying to find ways to improve that efficacy. There's cost questions with this, but these projects are being done as proof of concept. Next slide, please, Mike. Finally, we're kind of working with management of land application processes, and this is really a joint thing between EGLE and MDARD. We've gotten questions on biosolids. Application is regulated and enforced by, and compliance is enforced by EGLE through the Water Quality Division. These cannot just be randomly spread, and so if there's questions pertaining to that, or you think something's happening, outside of what you think is normal, this is an area where EGLE is actually regulating those applications. On the fertilizer side, working through the MAEAP program, we rely on 4R stewardship principles as well as tri-state nutrient recommendations for crops. So we're looking at the right fertilizer source, the right rate, the right time, and the right place. We want to make sure that producers are not over applying nutrients, and we talk so much about phosphorus, but we're concerned, and we through the MAEAP program, we look at nitrogen as well, because nitrogen contributes to the toxicity of the bloom. We know that, and so we can't forget nitrogen in this equation as we try and fight the phosphorus or reduce the phosphorus loading as well. And finally, on the manure management side, we've had questions on CAFOs and manure management there. Michigan's draft 2020 NPDES permit includes restrictions of manure spreading from January through March, among other water quality measures that they've actually put into the new permit that goes into effect here around April 20th, I believe, Mike, is the release date of that.
This is Phil. The actual permit will be issued later this week, before April 1st.
Beautiful. Thank you, Phil. Next slide, Mike. So Mike mentioned briefly the what we call CREP, or the Conservation Reserve Enhancement Program, and we are working to get that program renewed. The program began in 2001, and it was a dedicated source of funding to put practices in place that we know kept sedimentary phosphorus out of streams, out of rivers, out of ditches. And those practices, as you can see here, filter strips, riparian buffers, sediment control basins, windbreaks, wetland restorations, introduce grass and legume establishment. You may as well keep flipping, Mike, because there's all these pictures that we probably don't have time to look at them all. But they were 8 specific practices out of NRCS's whole suite of BMPs that could be implemented through this program. We're looking to get that restored. We have an opportunity with some match from the state to get that program started again. And we are hoping to do that over the next year or so, working with both our state legislators as well as our federal partners. Next slide. You've kind of saw this slide earlier. The importance of CREP is we saw up through 2016, Mike mentioned it, we saw a general decline, basically a good slope to the reductions of phosphorus loading to the River Raisin. However, a couple things happened in 16. First of all, the program, the first innovators, the first people that were in the CREP program, their contracts expired. Those were 15-year contracts. And secondly, there was a mix-up with the Farm Service Agency where they interpreted where those practices could be installed differently. And it required producers to have their contracts voided and those acres come out of the program. And as a result, you can see, here's kind of just a quick slide to see how the acreage is declining. On the next slide here, you'll see that as a result, we saw these scatter points start to rise again. We believe that those are tied directly to these reductions in CREP acres along streams along the River Raisin. And so we're trying to get this program implemented again to get those acres back with cover on them on a year-round basis to help reduce this loading. Next slide, Mike. I think with that, I'm going to wrap it up here and we will take questions. Thank you.
All right, this is Jim, just bringing it back here. Thanks, Joe, for your presentation. I'm going to launch a quick poll here while I'm getting stuff reset. And I want to remind everyone that you are welcome to ask questions or submit comments to the question box that you have in front of you. So go ahead and do that if you have any. With that, got a few people voting here. Thank you. This question is kind of funny now that basically because of the social distancing that most people are going to be choosing one. So thank you. All right, and Mike, I'm going to bring the presentation back here to me.
Okay.
Okay. All right, so questions. I'm going to start getting the questions right now, guys. First question is, what is the method for partners to let you know they are interested in participation in a wetland creation demonstration project? So, Mike, you want to take that?
Sure, you can just email me and I will pass along any information you have to our partners with the Department of Natural Resources.
All right, easy enough. Okay, this question is for Joe. You mentioned that the retention rate farmers that participate is pretty high, 85%. Mm-hmm. Are most farmers currently participating in MAEAP? What is the percentage of participation?
It's hard for me to judge the participation. I can't really do it by number of farms. Remember, within MAEAP, you can have multiple verifications on a farm. So sometimes we have about 5,500 verifications statewide, and people will say, well, that's 5,500 farms. No, it's probably somewhere around 3,000 farms. According to Mass Statistics, Michigan Ag Statistics, there's about 50,000 farms in the state. So you could base that and say, well, you know, you got whatever, 7%, 10% of the farms. I look at more at it from an acreage standpoint, though. And when I did our last annual report, we were running around 15 or 16% of the basin was actually on farms that were MAEAP verified. And my goal before I retire from this program is that we have 100% of those acres MAEAP verified.
All right, that's a good goal. All right, next question. How much of this phosphorus is from personal fertilizer in neighborhoods? Let's take that.
Mike, do you want me to try to answer that one, Mike?
Sure.
Yeah, so Michigan in 2012 instituted a ban on fertilizer for residential purposes. So in January of 2012, there was a elimination of that from application and therefore discharge. So that's something that Michigan can be proud of.
Okay. Thanks, Phil. The plan discusses wetland mitigation banking and regional digesters as projects. Is the proposed bank going to use the Michigan Municipal Wetland Alliance to promote agricultural and municipal use? Will EGLE work to help? I'm sorry, just the question cut off. Will EGLE work to help streaming the permit process to help digesters go into place more quickly?
So I'll take the wetland question first, and then I'll defer the digester to Phil. So we are currently working, the Department of Natural Resources is working with a variety of options to try and figure out how they're going to implement the wetland banking, or as it associates with this wetland creation and restoration process. And so I would expect that a more detailed plan will be included in our 2-year work plan for the adaptive management.
Okay, Phil, you want to talk about the digesters?
Sure. So digesters are something that we think can be really important because we feel it can help reduce the amount of manure that needs to be land applied. It can be helpful for energy resources by them connecting back to either produce gas, biogas, or electricity too. And there are some of these that are actually going in line right now or thinking about going in line. Some are on the west side of the state. It would be great if we got some in the Western Basin or tributary area to the Western Basin of Lake Erie. We, on the permitting process, it's possible to permit these under the CAFO permit. And we're encouraging these to be permitted as well. So I think that this is a great solution or a great way to help give us another tool that we can help reduce phosphorus discharge.
Next question, they're asking, will the drain code be used? That's all he asked.
I can't answer that question. I think it's something we can certainly consider as part of our 2-year planning process, and where we can use any tools, including the drain tool, to the drain code to address problems. But at this point, I can't really answer the question.
Yeah, okay. How would mass quantities of fish tank chemical cleaners affect the waterways?
Well, it'd probably kill everything in the
yeah
in the aquatic life in the streams. I'm assuming they mean by like trying to treat the actual surface water body itself. So I'll take that question as assuming that's the case. That would be that'd be a violation of our water quality standards, applying something specifically like a nutrient reducer or phosphorus to the surface water. So, and it would have a significant impact on aquatic life in the system. So that would kind of be counterproductive to what we're trying to accomplish. I think the best approach would be to prevent the nutrients from getting to the stream or reduce them to a manageable and acceptable level, rather than try to treat the stream itself.
Mm-hmm. Next one, have the agencies estimated the amounts of phosphorus that can be applied in the watersheds as biosolids, manure, and fertilizer, and achieve the phosphorus loading reduction objective?
So maybe I can start with that. With both the biosolids program and the CAFO program, phosphorus has to be applied at agricultural rates that are acceptable for growing crops. So I think it's important to understand that both biosolids and manure application through our CAFO permit are based on that level. Now, we have seen water quality impacts. We have seen water quality impacts in impaired areas like the Western Basin of Lake Erie or other impaired areas in the state, both for nutrients and for E. coli. And so one of the things that we have to make sure that we do is make sure in this new permit that we've worked out for CAPOs that we adequately land apply in order to help reduce some of those water quality impacts.
Okay, thanks, Phil. We have time for one more question, and luckily it's our last question. So how much do septic systems contribute to the phosphorus loading?
Maybe I'll try to answer that as well. We don't have a statewide septic code, and we really believe in EGLE that it's important to establish a statewide septic code. There are impacts from failing septic tanks, that's for sure. We have to make sure that that those systems are corrected through our local health departments. I don't know the degree that it influences the problems that we see in the Western Basin, but it is something that we have to continue to seek resolution to, and we have to make sure that all the locals have adequate time of sale ordinances or other cleaning processes to make sure that even failed septic tanks are reinstalled to meet current requirements. So it is something that's in our list. It's something that it's in our original domestic action plan, and it's certainly something that we want to see addressed.
Jim, this is Mike. I want to add something to answer, partially answer, or hopefully try to answer those last two questions. So there are watershed management plans that you could put together, models per se on a small scale that can estimate loading contributions from various types of land use and activity, including taking into consideration septic system contributions that could be used to establish targets. The problem is it takes a lot of time to implement, and they're costly to do. We implemented or developed a couple up in Hillsdale in the Bean Creek watershed, and we can actually use those watershed management plans and models to try and set some individual targets within those watersheds. One of the goals we have in our adaptive management plan is to try and develop more and more of those smaller sub-watershed plans that could help us identify targets and goals at a smaller scale that we can, again, show that progress. But the problem we have is that it's a voluntary process. We put a request for proposals out, and we can't force anyone to implement that development of a watershed management plan. So, but we're hopeful that through this process and working with local stakeholders that we can get more people applying for those grants to develop those really detailed watershed management plans that'll help us reach our goals. There's one thing we'll continue to track, though.
All right, thanks, Mike. And that brings us to about the end of our time tonight. I want to thank Mike and Phil and Joe for the presentations. And I want to thank all of you as well for joining us. I know this session was originally planned to be a live event, but because of the situation, we're having to move a lot of our live meetings to online meetings. So, I hope that you found this useful. And if you have more questions or want more information, you see on the website there, michigan.gov/Lake Erie DAP. And there's Mike's email, of course, as well. It's been up there. I want to thank all you again for joining us. I will be following up after the next day or so with an email that's going to have a link to the recording for this webinar. So if you want to pass that on to someone that might have missed it, it'll be there. And I think we'll also be posting it on the website. So with that, thank you all for joining us. Stay healthy and have a great evening.
Thanks, Jim.
Thank you, Jim.
Thanks, Jim.